In my career in healthcare, I can't think of a job that I enjoyed more or that moved me more than working at Cook Children's Hospital in Fort Worth. Cook Children's is a large tertiary care hospital, pediatric medical center. It is dedicated to serving children only. It has hundreds of beds, and it has some of the world's best physicians, pediatricians, in specialties that are just very, very hard to find. And I had the distinct pleasure of being able to work in the emergency department at Cook's and spend just hundreds of hours doing nothing but taking care of pediatric patients. It could be anything from asthma to transplant recipients or people who are waiting for a transplant, psych issues, just this plethora of conditions that affected pediatric patients. I could spend 12 hours talking about my experiences there and some of the kids that I came in contact with and some of the things seen there. And it was an incredibly moving experience. I'm so glad that I had it. And you hear me reference it in the classroom quite frequently. But there is a topic that comes out of that has to be discussed here. It's not a fun topic, but it's an incredibly important one. And that topic is abuse and neglect. Don't think for a minute that because you work in a primary care office that you won't see that. Abuse and neglect are far more prevalent than almost anyone realizes. Another complicating factor to that, which we'll get to here in a minute, is that not all abuse and neglect is intentional or cognizant or the byproduct of evil. Sometimes abuse and neglect in particular is the byproduct of mental illness on the part of a parent, cognitive impairment on the part of a parent, substance abuse on the part of a parent. There's a whole plethora of things that can cause a situation to qualify as abuse or neglect, even though no one has that intention. So during a 12-hour shift in the emergency department at Cook's, I worked, most of the time I worked 3 p.m. to 3 a.m., which is the busiest shift that they had. We would easily see 300 or 350 kids come through the ER in those 12 hours. I can't recall a single night that I worked at Children's in which a patient was not brought in making what we commonly called an outcry, or in other words, I was sexually abused by my XYZ. My dad slapped me across the face. I mean, I guess just for lack of a better word, a credible story or a narrative or an accusation that abuse had taken place. Now, the sad part about that was that neither ending, as far as truth or untruth goes, was good. If the story was true, then a child had indeed been abused, and they had indeed been molested or whatever the accusation was. On the other hand, if it was false, someone genuinely crossed the line in trying to accuse someone else or get someone else in trouble. Sadly, the latter was more common than the former. I guess sadly in the sense that it was not uncommon to see divorced parents in the middle of a custody battle use outcries as a weapon. So, you know, parent number one coaching the child to accuse parent number two of doing something that they didn't do. And so I want you to just simmer on that for a minute. Imagine being the MA rooming a patient. You're rooming a mother and an 8-year-old girl. And when you ask why they have come to the office today, the mother answers the question, well, my little girl was molested by her uncle who did this, that, and the other. If you think that that is an uncomfortable situation, you're right, and uncomfortable doesn't even begin to scratch the surface of just how troubling that is. It's troubling for more reasons than just considering that something may have happened. It's Troubling because you now hold a package that you can't get rid of. You are going to have to tell somebody about the outcry that was made, and you know that this story ends one of two ways, neither of which is good. Either the story is true and your patient was molested, or the story is untrue and your patient has now, I argue, been abused by someone who is trying to coach them into making this story. At Cook's, if we performed abuse prevention exams or evidentiary exams on every outcry patient, we would have had to have 4 or 5 full-time people doing these exams. And again, I want you to take a step back and think about this for a minute. I hope that nobody listening to this conversation has had to undergo a SANE exam, sexual assault nurse examination. Sadly, some of you probably have. If you have been through that procedure and that collection, you know it is something you wouldn't wish on your worst enemy, and you certainly wouldn't wish it on an 8-year-old girl or boy, for that matter. When you make an allegation, when an allegation was made against a parent or a teacher or someone else, it would not have been wise to immediately jump to that kind of exam because the number of people making false outcries or very deceptive outcries is so much higher than you think. And it taints the playing field for those who are not lying about it. There was very little difference when people came through the door and reported having had been the victim of an abuse scenario. There was no way to tell which ones were true and which ones weren't, not at that moment. And Cook's had to have a protocol. They had to do something so that we weren't just taking 6, 7, 8-year-old kids to a SANE exam over and over and over again during these outcries. So what Cook's had instead was a forensic child psychologist. And the forensic child psychologist had one role, and that role was to be the gatekeeper, to talk to the individual who was the victim of the alleged assault or misconduct, and to just take them in a room and interview them to make a determination about whether or not there was just cause to proceed to this incredibly invasive and painful for children SANE exam. I wish I could remember the percentage, and I don't want to speculate on a crazy number. I can tell you that there is no doubt in my mind that 8 out of 10 reports were patently false. It was a weaponization against another parent, and there wasn't anything else behind that. And I think it was higher than that. I'm being very conservative with that. And so the role of the forensic psychologist was to help bring that out with words so that that process of the SANE exam could be avoided if there was no evidence. And the evidentiary standard by that was actually very high. So in other words, all of the protocols associated with that erred on the side of caution, to where I would say it this way: if the forensic child psychologist recommended that a SANE exam not proceed, it was because there was overwhelming evidence that the claim was false, not the other way around. If there was any concern at all that there might be truth or even some truth to the story, that would be fleshed out, and we would go ahead and go with the exam. So I say that to say you will face those outcries. They will come to you from time to time if you work in family practice, pediatrics, urgent care, and some will be true and a lot will not be true. We talked now just about the SANE exam and how it does its part sort of to try to collect evidence from that, and we'll look at a few of the pieces of that procedure here in a minute. If the allegation of abuse isn't sexual in nature, it's physical otherwise, then what is typically done is called a skeletal survey. And a skeletal survey is essentially a full body x-ray, low radiation, that's looking for a few very specific things. What do you think those things are? If I were to ask you, if you were in my classroom right now and I said, what do you think we look for on an x-ray, a full body x-ray of a kid, to determine if there's abuse taking place? Well, let me start by saying this. Kids are clumsy. They fall down all the time. There are genuinely kids who roll off the top bunk. There are kids who fall through a window. There are all kinds of things that kids do. I remember one of the calls that I really remember running in Fort Worth was to come and evaluate a child who had fallen from a third-story window of an apartment to the ground below. And his mom figured out that he had fallen because she went to look for him in his room, and he wasn't there. And as she was panicking and kind of looking around the house trying to figure out where he might be, she heard a knock on the door. So she goes to open the door, and there's her son on the outside of the door. I think he was 3 or 5. I can't remember the age for sure. But the long story is he pushed out the screen in his room, flopped over the windowsill, landed in a bush that he climbed down from uninjured, and then came around and got back up and went back up to the apartment and knocked for his mom to let him in. Yeah, I mean, that's a true story. If I told you that story in an exam room, you'd probably think I was crazy, and maybe you should think I was crazy. But it was very clear, even from the surveillance cameras in the complex, it was very clear that's what happened. So kids are clumsy. Kids do break things. So it isn't enough to do a skeletal survey and just look for fractures. You might find fractures, and that also doesn't mean that the child was abused. So what are we looking for? The key words are various stages of healing. Various stages of healing. If a kid falls out of a top bunk or they flop themselves over the window of an apartment, all of their injuries will be associated with that episode. In other words, when you do a skeletal survey, those should be the only injuries you find. You're going to look at some pictures now, and I'm going to warn you, these pictures are hard. Some of these are some absolutely terrible pictures. If I know the backstory, I'll tell you. If I don't, we're just going to still look at it. But what I want you to do as we go through these here now and look at a few of these images, I want you to think about what you see that tells you this is abuse versus just a clumsy child. And as we go through this, we'll kind of talk through it as we go. I'm going to leave you with one final thought before we jump into that exercise, and that thought is this. Whether we're talking about geriatric or pediatric patients, neglect is often more common than abuse, and neglect is often not the result of evil intention. Sometimes abuse is not the result of evil intention. I remember taking care of kids who would come in to cooks starving, literally starving, 11, 12, 13 years old, skin and bones, just as bad as the pictures you see from concentration camps in Nazi Germany. And you would initially look at that and go, oh my gosh, how could a parent let this happen? And then as you sit down and talk to the parents, what you realize is that the child they brought in has severe autism and cognitive delay, but so do the parents. And the story is that little Johnny will not eat anything more other than soda and crackers, and since they can't get him to eat anything else, then he's just going to eat, he's just been eating soda and crackers for the last 6 months. That's not an evil person. It's abuse and neglect, but it's not an evil person. It's somebody who needs help parenting and help taking care of someone. There are a number of cases where I watch kids come through the door and they were covered in what looked like hickeys or bruises or burns. And as you go through the interview, you realize that this is an Eastern medicine sort of treatment. It isn't abuse. It's not cigarette burns or beatings. It's the result of something like cupping or coining, which we'll talk about here in a little bit. Again, looks like abuse, probably meets the legal definition of abuse, but very much based in love and normal relationship as opposed to evil. So I urge you to withhold judgment on those things. Be careful. You're a mandatory reporter, and you do absolutely have to report what you find if you're concerned about child or elder abuse or neglect. But just remember that not everything is as it appears. And there are a number of cases in which the story that's told is false, but not because someone is trying to hide something. I remember taking care of kids who had had a parent become either incapacitated or even die, and these kids had only each other, and they were homeschooled, and they were kind of isolated, and so they tried to live with an older sibling, 14, 15 years old, and kind of try to lead the house. And after no mortgage payments had been made for months, and et cetera, it comes to be that finally the police show up and discover that this thing has been going on for quite some time. There's religious involvement, and we'll talk about a little story about that here in a minute. But just know that as you are working as a medical assistant in primary care, you will get these outcries, you will have some concerns, and you should follow your organization's protocol, and you should do what you know is right and what you know is legal, which is it has to be reported. You can report to your physician, you can report to the police, you can report directly to CPS. All of those are acceptable ways. Most of you will want to report it to your doctor, your provider, and let them make a decision. So let's look at a few of the images that we're looking at in terms of how you identify abuse or neglect in adults or pediatrics, and see what you think.